My name's Michael Carney. I was born in Richmond, California in 1948, so I'm an old age guy at this point. Raised in Missouri, around Fort Leonard Wood. Both of my families are Missourians. Actually, my coach in Missouri was from Bentonville, and he gave my father the land that he built the home on. His name's Al Knox. And Al is one of three brothers who bought a 17-acre tract on Beaver Lake before the lake came in. So my first memories are when the lake came in, riding around in a boat with the trees still with leaves on them and catching crappie all night long. Benton County was already beginning to develop somewhat in 1963. But my memory is everything was a two-lane road or a dirt road, and it was a long way from one town to another town. When I arrived back in '96, we had become a metropolitan area with 4- and 6-lane highways being built and towns growing together. So I have watched over my lifetime Benton County develop into a metropolitan mecca. And that's still occurring today. Our growth is astronomical in this area. It's amazing. I work for the Benton County History Society as an archivist. My background is that when I arrived back from the Air Force system in Guam, I went to work for Benton County for the circuit clerk collecting the criminal restitution for the county for 4 years. From there, I went to be the recorder of deeds and mortgages for 2 years. And then the county clerk hired me to become the archivist or the records keeper for the county, and I did that for an additional 4 years. So I have 10 years of service with Benton County in the records area. Since 2006, I have been indexing the records from 1836 until 1899. I finished all of the real estate records, personal records. I have done all the assessor records for the county for that period. I have the Graduation Act of 1854 indexed, and all of those records are on file for people who want to find the history of their family at the History Society. There are probably 500,000 entries in all those indexes over that period from 6 until today. There was a dribble of persons moving into the West prior to the Civil War. The Indians, Osage and Cherokee, had been moved to this area. The Osage, of course, were the indigenous Indians here, and the Cherokees were moved out of Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and pushed into the area. So prior to 1828, the Indians primarily had the land in Benton County and were in warfare, which was killing hundreds of them a year. The U.S. government finally built a treaty that the Osage were almost forced to sign. The Cherokees gladly signed, and that moved both tribes to Oklahoma, ceding the land in eastern part of Benton County to settlers to move in. So that was the moment in time that part of the county began to develop. People like Van Winkle came in with a brother and 3 of his sisters, settled the mill out on the White River, while Anderson came into the other side of the county at Maysville. And actually Maysville is considered the oldest town in Benton County, the oldest development in Benton County. Both of those areas would later, during the Civil War, become major players in the development of the Confederacy in this area. Other parts of the county, Roller Ridge in the northeast was settled by the Roller family. There's still many of them in the area in the northeast part of this county. We had mills that developed all over the river areas of the county. The largest one, of course, was the Van Winkle Mill. And Sylvanus Van Winkle built that in 1843. It eventually washed down the river as floodwaters were not dammed at that time, and there was no way to save your mill if the river got up on a big stream. There were probably 100 mills throughout this county. So that's the development of food source for the people that were moving in here.
So, talk about what the settlers would use the mills for, and where are some of the other ones located?
Well, of course, most of the mills were grist mills, and a grist mill is a water wheel that is above the water line, and they ground corn and wheat and barley, and of course sacked it up and sold it to the settlers coming in buckets or pails or however they could move it out in their wagons. They even sold wagon loads of flour. They sold to the Indians that remained in the area that were married into the white people. So they were really the key source of bread and the main staples needed to survive in Benton County. Well, we think of Siloam Springs, of course, and that is out in the southwest corner of Benton County. If you remember, the Indians are moved just across the line into Oklahoma. So that part of the county developed with a culture of both Indians and European white people, where out in the lumber areas, like places like Posey Mountain, which are on the north side of Beaver Lake today, were developed because they had multiple ferries that were built across the river, and settlers could get into those areas. However, those areas are woodlands, and so the settlers that came were mostly loggers and guys that worked in the wood industry. Mountain people, the Ozark people that we always hear about, the rustic with the corncob pipe and the old hat on their head, the shepherd of the hills people, if you will, where conversely, the people that came across in the central and southern part of the county moved into the farmlands of Maysville, Cherokee City, Hyco, and up and down that range that's associated right on the Oklahoma line, because that was wonderful farmland. Not very many people brought slaves to Benton County. At the height of slavery, there were only 386 slaves. However, many of the slaves were brought into the eastern part because they worked in the fields, and they were used to that coming out of Alabama and Georgia. Conversely, the slaves that worked in the timber industry were industrial slaves. They were more educated about how to cut and work saws and work mills, and so they were a different sort of people than were in the western part of the county. The farmers in the eastern part were so much different than the millers in the western part, yet they traded with each other. So the culture grew as a result of these small towns growing up along the rivers. Mudtown, which is now Lowell, there's a town that grew up as a result of the trade that happened between the timberlands and the guys in the western part of the county. So that essentially, the growth in the economy was tied together by industrial people and then people that did farming. Of course, all the land was secured in the same way. Many of them got it under the Graduation Act of 1854, where they could buy it for 50 cents an acre, 75 cents an acre, $1 an acre, where others came here because they could get 40 or 80 acres of land under the Homestead Acts, which were enacted later. So that's primarily what drew the settlers to this area, was land and easy acquisition to land and the timber to build homes and develop the culture here. Let me tell you a little about Van Winkle first. Van Winkle came here as an immigrant, actually born in New York City, lived in Illinois, married when he was about 16, decided that Illinois was too settled, moved down to Fayetteville on the White River and began to build wagons and sweeps for roads. He was an engineer par excellence, and he actually built the wagons that went out to the California during the 49 gold rushes. And that's where he collected enough money to be able to secure land in Benton County. So in 1854, he came to Benton County, built his first mill, which was oxen driven. An ox would go around the circle and that would turn the saw blade. And unfortunately, in 1856, that flooded out. So he moved to higher ground, which is now in the Hobbs State Park in Benton County. And he eventually, after the Civil War, built a steam-powered mill, which was the largest steam-powered mill in the Midwest at that time, and began to mill lumber that built all of the communities across this county. That's when the real development of Benton County started, because they had the lumber source to develop the county. When he first came here, the virgin pine was extremely large. The Indians didn't use wood except for fires or building their wickiups or their teepees or the various housing units they had, so they used very little lumber. So all of the trees in the county were super large. Lore has it that when the first pioneers came through that timber country, that the pines were so large that they could drive between them in the wagons, because the Osage people would burn off all the ground cover every spring, and that left the land open between the trees. So there are accounts that pioneers have made historically how large that lumber was. You'd make massive amount of boards out of those large trees. Also, the hardwood was well developed in this area, and the softwoods grew mostly along the rivers. So you had all three types of wood. You had pine, you had softwood, and you had the hardwoods, which would serve so many communities' lumber yards. Van Winkle was the first one to actually figure out how to build a ferry. Therefore, he could get the lumber from the western part of the county over to the eastern part of the county. And that, again, helped the development of Benton County tremendously. Well, Bentonville, of course, developed in 1836, right at the beginning of statehood. And it was also when the county was identified as a county in Arkansas. It became the county seat, so naturally it became the center of economic development. From that, Rogers began to develop off the lumber trade that Van Winkle and the Blackburn family and many of the families that settled in this area had land, and that Rogers was a secondary city. It didn't develop until 1881 when it incorporated. The thing that made Rogers grow was the railroad moving into the area. When the Frisco Railroad came in, the line boss for the Frisco's name was Rogers. And so Rogers is named after him. In Lowell, that was called Mudtown. The railroad line boss's name was Lowell. And that's why Lowell is Lowell today. So that's how the development happened. Railroads, ferries, transportation systems. The History Society was able to secure the original real estate tax books, not all, some of them in the very early years of development. We also secured the personal tax record books. We secured the assessor's books from the beginning of the county. And all of those books have multi-thousand entries in them. And when I received those books and understood that that would tell me who was here, when they were here, where they were on the land, how much they own, both personal, because they had to pay personal taxes on their chickens, their hogs, their cattle, their wristwatches, their pianos, their wagons. I was able to see the prominence of a family by simply looking in those personal tax records. In the real estate tax records, I was able to see how much taxes they were paying on the land and how much land they owned. That would also tell me how prominent those people were. The assessor's record, on the other hand, told me how much they were assessed in taxes. And of course, that's a portion, that's just a percentage of the actual value. But those indicators also show you the prominence of the families that really developed the county, like the Dixons and the Blacks in Benton County, like the railroad men of Rogers, who really brought the money into that community. J.C. Blackburn, the son of the Blackburn mill owner, Sylvanus Blackburn, owned a massive amount of land, built hotels, just was a very prominent man in the Rogers area. Siloam Springs, you had the Carl family, that you see the streets are named Carl Street there. Those are the people that really developed that area of the state, or the county, I'm sorry, the county. Well, as you begin to think about how the development of this county started, the lovely purchase was the very beginning of the people who wanted to migrate into the northern part out of Washington County up into this county. So from that point, we began to see that Washington County, Benton County, Madison County, and Carroll County were all one county at that point. When that got separated in 1836 and broke out Benton County, Madison County, Carroll, and then Washington County, we began to see the records develop and families moved from Georgia, Alabama. Many of them moved into Washington County early and then migrated north because they could get free land up here, or land at almost no cost to them almost. Though 50 cents at that time probably had value, but still 50 cents an acre is a pretty good amount for an acre of land. Those are things that we often don't talk about, but we can see that the really prominent families developed because of these economic issues that were offered to them by the federal government to move into these areas and to develop these areas of the country. The development of the lake was because the White River continued to spill out over the countryside and ruin so much of the timberland and flood people out. So as the federal government began to control rivers like the Tennessee Valley Authority did, they moved into Benton County, and we became the upper watershed of 5 lakes that eventually run into the Mississippi River. We run into Table Rock, and the water is stored here to run water into Table Rock when they get low, and that water runs into Bull Shoals, and so it goes on to the Mississippi through the 5 lakes. That development, of course, was probably the thing that began to develop the county on a large scale. Bring in industry like Tyson's, bring in industry like the trucking industry, which is the largest in the nation in this area. Bridges began to be built out of steel, and it's amazing the economics that the building of that lake brought to Benton County. Now let's go back in time now. A piece of the history of this county that we haven't talked about is the Civil War era. Benton County primarily was not Confederate leaning at the time that the war in Kansas and Missouri broke out in 1856. Of course, we know that the Civil War started with John Brown and He went to Maryland and tried to invade a military arsenal there and was caught and hanged. But more young men went to Cassville, Missouri and joined the Union than joined the Confederacy out of Benton County. Approximately 1,100 men went to Cassville. About 800 went to Fayetteville. All of them, almost to the man, were cavalry. They were farmers who were used to riding horses. In Missouri, they formed the 1st or 4th Missouri Cavalry at Cassville, who fought for the Union. In Fayetteville, the 1st and 2nd Arkansas Cavalry. And those guys actually met down in a battle just west of Fayetteville. And the Confederates not only lost the Battle of Pea Ridge, but they also lost that battle and moved on to Vicksburg.
Do you mean the one in Prairie Grove?
Prairie Grove. Yeah, that battlefield was a after action of the Battle of Pea Ridge. Different commanders in those two battles, but still there was a great loss to the Confederacy developing in this side of the state. And of course, we're trans-Mississippi, but it was still two major battles. Probably the most two major battles of trans-Mississippi that happened. So that's a significant part of Benton County's history. Several people were killed, civilians particularly, in the Leetown area by both armies. And as the Confederates came up through Cross Hollows, of course, we all know the story that they had a great battle right in front of the tavern. They were finally driven back down into Cross Hollows, and the Union won that because the Confederates left their supplies in another town that they couldn't get to and about 60 miles away. So they marched down to the Van Winkle Mill the night after the battle, took the corn out of his corn crib, crushed it, made cakes out of it. The men were strung out up and down the valley where the lake now is, by the way. In fact, I live right on the hill looking down at the mouth of Van Hollow, and those men were cooking those cakes on the flint rocks. It was sleeting. It was March 8th. The rocks began to blow up. They thought they were being attacked from the Federals, and many of them ran off into the thickets and the rocks, cut their feet up, and they said they had as many wounds out of that as they did out of the battle. Now, I don't know that that's not lore, but that story is written, and I have read that story. Also, there was a church by the Blackburn House just across the bridge at the Van Winkle Mill, or not at the Van Winkle Mill, excuse me, at the Blackburn Mill. And there was a church there that they took the wounded to, and they were treating their wounds. And a story came out of that one young man had his wounds treated on his leg. He started up the Old Wire Road to go home to Missouri, and his father met him on the road and took him home. And that was an interesting story, that a wounded Confederate would be trying to get home, and his father was coming to find him at the same time, and they happened to meet at Cross Hollows on the old road. I read that story. I don't know if that was perpetrated by lore or if that's a real story, but it was exciting to think about something like that actually happening during that period. As we think about county history, we have to remember now that you had slavery prior to the Civil War, so many of the events were occurring around those issues that caused people to be angry at each other. Then after the Civil War, when slaves were released, black people became prominent in Benton County and began to go into business and have their own homes. There are many, many homes in Bentonville that were built by former slaves of the period and their families. And many of those families are still here in the area. Jerry Moore who is a professor, was at the University of Arkansas, recently at NWAC, has written a tremendous amount about a particular slave that Peter Van Winkle owned. And his name's Aaron Van Winkle. There are no pictures except for one of Aaron, but there's a tremendous amount of history about how Aaron helped develop the culture around the black community after the Civil War. So when you begin to think about across the board all of the events that happened, they so tie into each other as we changed our attitudes and minds about how we accepted, after the Civil War, a change in the cultural norm. Even until today, we're still struggling with some of those cultural norm changes. We saw the statue moved off of the square of a Civil War likeness, and has since been moved to a memorial in the cemetery, which is an appropriate place to memorialize these men, both North and South, that fought for home and hearth or wanted the nation to stay together. The point that's usually not made in Benton County history is the state's influence in allowing some of these larger corporations to have tax advantages to come into the county. The trucking industry is one of the largest industries in this area. There are more trucking companies than anywhere in the CONUS United States, in the continental part of the United States. Most of that was driven by advantages they could get to either have land taxed at a less rate or building at a less cost, or you had brilliant people like Sam Walton who knew how to build an industry from the ground and did that, flying around in his own little airplane without a license at times, and flying over to Little Rock and bringing product back so he could sell women's underwear for $0.25 a piece in his store right here on the square. So that's the kind of pioneering spirit that you had here in the Bentonville area. Guys who had saddle shops, who developed the banking industry here. You had companies that came in from Kansas City who were financial companies. You had companies that would buy up land. For example, in Sulphur Springs, you had a company called the Town Company. And it bought up land and it sold those lots to different people to make a buck. You had a tremendous amount of influence from other places on the industry here. The apple industry, a massive industry, the largest industry in the United States from the time it began to develop until it died out when a plague came in off a Chinese freighter and killed all the fruit out in the county in the 1950s. You had chinky pin trees here. Chinky pin trees have a nut in them, and up until 1957, there was a large industry of chinky pin nuts all the way from Maine through the Ozarks. All of those trees, almost to the tree, died out because of a blight that came in and killed them. In fact, the Hobbs State Park is currently reseeding and resetting chinky pin trees in this county. I have one at my home that's now about 6 feet tall. Now, when I was a child in 1954, we used to pick up the husk off the ground up in Missouri and carry those in our pocket to school. Hopefully, we're going to put those trees, which are now blight-free, genetic engineering has made them blight-free, and we're beginning to replant them throughout Benton County. So there's a piece of information that many people don't know about. The only thing I would tell you, as the railroads begin to come in here and compete, you got things going on like Montanay and Coin Harvey building a massive structure, a hotel, gondola boats, and building that piece of the economic industry to fail in 1910. went bankrupt, but that was an amazing feat at the time by Coin Harvey. The Memphis Railroad was building a rail from Rogers out to Montanay, and that where they would have laid the tracks, still you could walk down those ridges where they made the right of ways open for the tracks. That failed, unfortunately. But what an amazing piece of history to happen in Benton County than the Coin Harvey story. Of course, Centerton grew up as an offshoot of Bentonville. That didn't start until about 1906, when lots and blocks began to be sold to different merchants out there. Now it's turned into a large town with a large high school. So you can see how the development of Benton County is happening today. Sulphur Springs once was a massive town. It was growing hand over fist. The railroad bypassed it early on, so it stopped developing. Heifel, there were massive amount of lots sold out there, people buying lots in the 1906, 1910 era. Today it's just a couple buildings there. So if you look at the history of how things fall and rise and fall and rise, you can see Bentonville is kind of an enigma. If an industry does not stay in their area, they fall. If an industry moves into their area, like the apple industry did up at Maysville and Sulphur Springs and Gentry and Gravette and those small tier towns up and down that Kansas City Southern Railroad, those towns wouldn't have made it. Many of those towns even today are not growing at an astronomical rate like we are in the Rogers, Bentonville, Centerton area, but they are still growing. So that tells you that this area of northwest Arkansas is going to become a major metropolitan economic area. All of that because of the pioneers who built these towns using different economic techniques to build them, whether that was industry, apples, whether that was farming, whether that was lumber. Here we are, we're becoming the metropolitan Dallas of northwest Arkansas.